The term hallucination today carries with it a meaning that it didn't always used to carry because of the way we use it in describing errors made by artificial intelligence. Now, I'm going to come back to that in just a moment, but first I want to tell you a story. A few years back, there were people who were close to me who thought they had me figured out. Now, I want to be very careful in how I say this because I'm genuinely not trying to condemn anybody, but I am going to be honest because honesty is the point of this whole talk. There was a combination of things, pop psychology videos, internet content that takes genuinely complex clinical diagnoses and flattens them into checklists of behaviors, bullet points of labels that confident people can see and process and see enough of so that it kind of confirms what they're thinking. When you combine that kind of just raw data along with what you actually see, it does help you confirm a lot of beliefs and come to a lot of conclusions even if those conclusions aren't necessarily accurate. And so people with strong opinions a number of years ago had seen some content, had seen me saying and doing things that were not within my usual alignment. And at least one mental health professional said a word that it was kind of sad that it was said because that mental health professional was never even in the room with me to tell me about it. And the word was narcissist. Now, first of all, none of the people in this story were intending to be malicious or, they didn't wake up one morning and say, hey, we want to cause Alan a whole bunch of problems. They saw real behaviors that I was exhibiting that were troubling. And they applied the best framework that was available to them at the time. And they arrived at conclusions that were about my inner life that they felt were airtight, but they were wrong. That word narcissist, thrown around carelessly, attached itself to my name and it traveled. It spread through conversations and through relationships and into the ears of people who had known me, many of them for decades. Friends who heard this spectacular word, the drama behind it, and they saw some of the troubling things that I was doing and they accepted that word as fact. And one by one, many of those relationships evaporated. Friendships I had for 20 and 30 years simply stopped because the word got to them before I did, and the word had already decided what I was. The damage was real. And the damage I'm talking about is not embarrassment, not inconvenience. It's lifelong relationships ended based on finite information processed by finite minds who arrived at certain conclusions and then acted on that certainty. Now, I want to be clear about something. I was falling apart in that season of my life. I had been battling clinical depression for 7 years and I was losing. It was ugly. I was trapped in this cycle of desperately wanting to feel better. But it seemed like nothing worked, or at least nothing worked well enough. And so I would just continue to spiral downward. That's the way depression works. You want more than anything to feel better, but nothing seems to help enough. It's incremental. And many times you just wind up getting sucked deeper instead of being able to pull yourself out of the pit. As a result, I was not the man that I had been previously. I was more reactive. I was angrier. I was saying and doing things that really didn't align with the character that people had seen in me for many, many years. And it was jarring. It ruined my marriage. It broke up my family. The things I was doing were genuinely ugly at times. The behaviors that raised the alarm for people, they were real. But what nobody could see was what was going on under those behaviors. They couldn't see that With every failure, I loathed myself more. I would lay awake at night replaying the tapes of all the angry and hurtful things that I said, and the regret was becoming a mountain. The guilt, the shame, the self recrimination, it was daunting. Now, here's the thing about narcissistic personality disorder, the real disorder. The inner life of a narcissist is not defined by self doubt. It's defined by a level of certainty and overconfidence to the point of justification for almost anything. The narcissist does not feel guilty about those things. They don't feel loathing about those things. They only feel loathing for the other people who make them angry or make them feel whatever it is that they're feeling. Their inner life is an absence of self doubt. But my inner life was nothing but self doubt. But nobody could see that. They could only access the outputs, the pretending that I had it together until I couldn't anymore, the contradictory behaviors, the hurtful actions, the angry words, and the conclusions that they built based on what they saw in the overabundance of oversimplified pod psychology, plus the absence of actual direct access to what was going on inside of me, led them to conclusions that felt airtight. So I just had to move on. Later, I started dating somebody, and it was really neat. She had come, sadly, out of a genuinely painful relationship, and her wariness was very well earned. So I was trying to be cautious and gentle and kind, and she was responding very, very well to that. And I was trying hard not to be the guy that I had become. I was digging out of that pit of depression and finally, for the first time in, at that point, 8 years, finding some progress in that regard. So this relationship was a bright spot. It was a hopeful moment in, I think, both of our lives. Until one day I used a single word to describe one of her behaviors, something that she did that I felt was invasive. And the word that I chose to use was probably not the right word, but it was toxic. I said that what she did felt toxic to me. And that everything changed in an instant. The only thing that she heard was that word. Apparently, she had a visceral objection to that word that I did not fully understand. And I, still reeling from my divorce, from my suicide attempt, from the mental illness that I had been battling and was barely starting to manage, responded like a complete jerk. The guy that I hated came out again. And I hurt her in a very real way. The relationship ended painfully. A little while later, she mailed me a note with a $30 gift card in it. And she said in the note, no hard feelings, which at the time I thought was ironic because I still had plenty of hard feelings. And I did something truly petty. I went back to my bank account and I looked up every penny that I had spent on gas and on dates and gifts and things like that. And I wrote her a note back. And I said, thanks for the $30. That almost makes up for the nearly $1,000 I wasted on you. That was nothing short of cruelty. She wrote back. She called me a narcissist. She blocked me everywhere, and I deserved it. Now, I want to stop here because I need to be honest about some questions. Were the people who labeled me, were they wrong that I had done harmful things? No, they were right about that. Were they right that I was a narcissist? No, they were wrong about that. Was I wrong to send that note? Without question. Had I done real things that had truly hurt my ex-wife and my family and my friends and that woman? With certainty. The damage I caused was real. And here's what I've come to understand as I've processed this over the last few years. Nobody in this story was intrinsically evil. Nobody intended to cause harm. But what we all were, every single one of us, was finite. We were operating on incomplete information, certain beyond what our data actually supported, and producing harm that can't be undone. It can be forgiven, it can be learned from, it can be moved past, but it will always have existed. There's a phrase that I've carried through all of this. We judge ourselves by our intentions, and we judge others by their actions. And through that, what I've come to understand is that this is not primarily a moral failure. It's not cruelty or malice or weakness. It's a math problem, which brings me back to the original topic, AI and hallucinations. In 2025, a man named Vishal Sikka and his son wrote a paper. And if you don't know Vishal Sikka's name, you should. He's a former CEO of Infosys. He sits on the board at Oracle, and he holds a PhD from Stanford and studied under John McCarthy, who is literally the guy who coins the phrase artificial intelligence. So Vishal Sikka is not a fringe thinker. He's somebody who has spent decades at the center of the technology industry. He's somebody who, when he talks about AI and technology, speaks with real experience and carries with him genuine authority on the subject. And what he and his son published was not speculation, it was proof. Using computational complexity theory that has been mathematically settled since the 1960s, they were able to demonstrate something that the AI industry does not particularly want you to hear. The large language models that power the AIs that we use have a hard architectural ceiling, and that ceiling determines how much they can actually compute per response. Now, the ceiling is not there because the designers put it there. The ceiling is there because we live in a finite universe and there are finite resources and there are only so many compute limits that can be broken through. So there's always a ceiling. Now, AI is getting better and it'll get better in the future. So the ceiling will continue to raise. But here's what the math proved: in this universe, there will always be a ceiling. Now, let me make this concrete. Every time a model like ChatGPT or Claude generates an answer, it processes the question through something called transformer architecture. And that means it has a fixed compute budget per token or per word. Every word costs the same amount of computational effort, whether that word is something simple like the word the, or something complicated like the word acetylcholinesterase. So here's where this gets critical and compelling at the same time. There's a fundamental distinction between solving a problem and verifying a solution. This is a part of computer science. Verifying is almost always easier than solving. We can verify that a jigsaw puzzle is complete just by looking at it. But solving it from the beginning, when it's a pile of pieces, that is a whole different level of computational complexity. It's a lot harder. It requires much more compute on the effort of the human, on behalf of the human, to be able to solve the puzzle than it takes just to verify the puzzle. And that same limit applies to AIs. What Sikka and his son proved is that many of the questions we ask AI systems fall into the hard to solve category. And they require more computational architecture than the model actually has access to. So it can't actually arrive at the correct answer. It can't solve the puzzle. So what does it do instead? It verifies. It scans everything that it's been trained on. It finds enough corroborating pattern to make the conclusion feel supported and delivers the conclusion with complete confidence. But it doesn't prove. It only verifies. And if the training data is full of content that points in a direction, it's always going to wind up in that direction, whether that direction is true or not. This is not a minor technical footnote. This is the central problem of artificial intelligence. Because here's what lives on the internet in enormous quantity: pop psychology content, oversimplified explanations of genuinely complex clinical conditions, countless videos telling countless people what certain behaviors mean and what labels belong on the people displaying those behaviors. If we watch enough content, if we absorb enough of the pattern and we share it with enough people who absorb that from us, and then in the comment sections they confirm that we are correct, our internal systems arrive at a conclusion that feels exactly like knowledge. And that is also what AI does. It's not always knowledge, it only seems like knowledge. That's what we call a hallucination. And here's the part that the AI industry really doesn't want to say out loud. For certain categories of problems, hallucination is not a bug, it's mathematically unavoidable. It cannot be engineered away. It cannot be trained away. It can be reduced. It can be improved. But the ceiling is real, and there will always be a ceiling in the architecture. The model doesn't know what it doesn't know, and it only knows what it can confirm. And confirmation is not the same as truth, at least not all the time. Detecting and verifying patterns feels like knowledge, but it's not always knowledge. The model looks at the data shows a pattern, the pattern produces a conclusion, and the conclusion feels airtight. Hmm, sounds a lot like human minds, doesn't it? Now, I'm going to throw out a couple of terms here that are kind of hot topics, buzzwords. And I want us to stop for just a minute and try and process these terms like we've never heard them before. Because although they're relatively new in the way that we describe things, they're really as old as human history. The concept is not new, just the vocabulary. So stay with me for a second. The words are pattern recognition and confirmation bias. What happens is that most of the harm that we cause, not the harm that we intend, but the harm that we actually produce on accident in the lives of real people, it comes from these two things working together. We see enough to recognize a shape, we find enough there to confirm a particular pattern, one that agrees with our conclusions, and then we stop looking. We judge, we act, and the damage follows. That is not a modern psychological phenomenon, and it is not something that emerged with the internet, social media, or AI. It's the oldest story in human history. A finite mind, certain beyond what its information actually supports, producing consequences that it never intended, but it can't take back. The mathematician calls it a verification error. The psychologist calls it confirmation bias, and the theologian calls it sin. It's the same ceiling, but with three different views underneath it, coming to the same conclusion, just using different words. Now, I'm a person of faith, and I want to talk about that last word, sin, for just a minute, because I know that it makes some of us uncomfortable, and rightly so. I'm not going to use it, though, in the way that maybe you expect. The word sin often carries with it baggage that it shouldn't, because the word in the New Testament, Greek, is the word hamartia, and it's an archery term. It means when an arrow misses the target or misses the mark. The arrow has sinned, or the archer has sinned. They missed what they were aiming at. Now, this is an important concept because when the archer knocks the arrow, pulls back the bow, and releases the arrow, the archer is doing it with the intention of hitting a target, not with the intention of missing. But sometimes they miss, and that arrow hits something. Now, sometimes it's harmless. It just, hits a piece of wood. Well, it leaves a permanent mark in that wood, doesn't it? Maybe it hits the dirt. That's no big deal. That can recover fairly simply. But what if it hits a horse or a cow or a child? It's damage that was not intended, but it can't be undone. The arrow's not evil. The archer is not evil. The mark was simply missed. And here's what we need to understand about that image. Missing the mark does not require malicious intent. The archer can be careful, experienced, and well meaning and still miss. The arrow does not care about intentions. It lands where it lands. And whatever it hits when it lands, it just damages, whether the archer meant it or not. And that is the problem of sin that people rarely talk about. We tend to think of sin as deliberate wickedness, as premeditated, intentional cruelty. And sometimes it is that. We as humans can just be nasty sometimes. But far more often than not, sin is the result of something else entirely. It's incomplete information in a finite mind operating with limited knowledge and a limited perspective in limited time, which produces an outcome that misses the mark, not because of malice, but because of limitation. And the suffering that results, the pain, the damage, the relationships that end and can't be rebuilt, that is real evil. Evil is not just something that happens when somebody intends wrongdoing. Evil is the suffering and the pain that happens even when it's not intended. Now, this is the part that should keep us up at night. When we are doing it intentionally, deliberate cruelty, that's that's something that we can at least see coming. If we have any self-awareness at all, we can recognize that that is building in us and we're thinking about doing something bad. But a finite mind operating confidently on incomplete information looks exactly like wisdom right up until the moment that the damage is done. I wrote a sci-fi novel called AI World: The Sapient Chronicles, and in it there's a character named Gabriel who's a pastor, and he's having an interesting conversation with a young AI who is just coming to terms with the moral weight of its own existence. And here's what Gabriel says to this artificial intelligence. The distinction is not between good beings and evil beings, it's between limited minds and unlimited consequences. Only infinite knowledge paired with infinite goodness can produce uncorrupted moral action. Everything else is limited, fallible, capable of harm, even with good intentions. I wrote those words before I ever encountered Sikka's paper, but Gabriel and Sikka are saying the exact same thing. A finite mind operating on incomplete information within a fixed time budget will inevitably miss the mark, and that is the mathematical definition of a hallucination. It is also the theological definition of sin. The problem with humanity and with AI and with every finite mind that is in existence, has ever existed, or will ever exist, is not that we are intrinsically evil. It's that we are implicitly evil. Every divorce, every unjust firing, every angry outburst that we can't take back, every fracture in a parent-child relationship, every friendship that simply stops one day and is never restarted. These are not abstractions. These are real and unavoidable consequences of finite minds with incomplete data and unearned certainty. That is implicit evil. It does not require a villain. It only requires limitation. And limitation is the one thing that every mind has in common. Now, before anybody gets a little too uncomfortable and thinks I'm pointing the finger, let me be clear. I'm first pointing at myself. Before we finalize our conclusions about other people in our lives, before we decide that we have them figured out, before we act on the patterns that we see and that we recognize and the data that we've confirmed, I want to encourage all of us to seek more, to listen harder, to hold our certainty a little more loosely, because I've done the opposite. And some of the most painful experiences in my life walked in straight through that door. It's what the mathematician calls a verification error, what the psychologist calls confirmation bias, and what the theologian calls sin. It's what I call the most human thing there is, and the most dangerous. But thankfully, we can recognize it if we make the effort. And when we do that, that gives me hope. And it's that hope that helps me to believe that the best is yet to come.